Ho Chi Minh had great hopes that the U.S. would support the Vietnam desire for independence, not necessarily by intervening, but by doing what it could to support an independence movement.
Ho Chi Minh's hopes for American support were calculated but understandable. President Franklin Roosevelt had promised a post-war world that would respect the rights of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they live. But Roosevelt was dead now, and his successor, Harry Truman, had inherited a very different world. The alliance with the Soviet Union that had won the Second World War had collapsed. The Soviets now occupied the Eastern European countries they had overrun and hoped to spread their influence farther into Iran, Turkey, and the Mediterranean. A new Cold War had begun. French President Charles de Gaulle warned that if the United States insisted on independence for her colonies, France might have no choice but to fall into the Russian orbit. The United States must do nothing to undercut the restoration of France's empire, including Vietnam.
There were hardly any Americans in Vietnam, State Department people, consular officials, a few businessmen. Hardly anyone from this country knew where Vietnam was located.
George Wicks was part of a 7-man OSS mission sent to Saigon, the largest city in the South. The United States was officially neutral, hoping the French and Viet Minh could reach some peaceful solution on their own. Allied leaders had agreed temporarily to divide Vietnam into 2 separate zones. Nationalist Chinese troops were to handle things in the north. British colonial troops would try to perform the same task in the south, where rival factions, including the French and Viet Minh, were already fighting in the streets of Saigon.
No one was in charge. On both sides, there was brutality and atrocity and violence. It wasn't quite a civil war, but it was getting very close to civil war in the streets of Saigon.
Lieutenant Colonel Peter Dewey, the 28-year-old commander of the OSS in Saigon, tried to make sense of it all.
Right from the start, he was in touch with everybody. Not only the French, but very soon he established a connection with various Vietnamese groups. The Viet Minh soon established themselves as the most successful.
Dewey, who spoke fluent French, brokered talks between a Viet Minh spokesman and the senior French representative in the city. His efforts infuriated British General Douglas Gracie, who commanded Allied forces in the south. Gracie was convinced that French control should be reimposed as soon as possible. By conferring with the Viet Minh, Gracie said, Colonel Dewey had become a subversive force. The violence in and around Saigon escalated. Colonel Dewey urgently cabled his superiors. Vietnam is burning, he wrote. The French and British are finished here, and the United States, he concluded, ought to clear out of Southeast Asia. 2 days later, September 26, 1945, he set out for the airport, prepared to fly to OSS headquarters. At a roadblock, the Viet Minh mistook Dewey for a Frenchman and opened fire. He was killed instantly.
Ho Chi Minh wrote to the United States, lamenting the deaths of Dewey, whom he recognized as a person sympathetic to his cause. It seemed a terrible irony that Dewey, who was doing what he could to help the Vietnamese independence movement, should have been killed by the Vietnamese by a mistake.